I just said that when I have my own place, everything will be drinking out of mason jars. I love mason jars. They're the best.
Okay.
I'm all about the mason jars. I think.
Really?
Yeah, I love mason jars. I think like wine, obviously no, and like whiskey and stuff probably get specific glasses for that stuff. But like any drink, mason jars all day. Anyways,
Yeah. Enough of that. Let's talk about
yeah, let's talk about
talk
D&D.
about stocks. What?
Let's get in to the episode. What's up?
Not much, dude. I'm rocking a new setup.
Yeah, you're in a new place.
Yeah. Well,
I'm gonna be honest, it looks a little more crowded.
I can. Yeah, I see how the angle would have you thinking it's crowded, but it's like, it's just because everything is like kind of on one side of the room, but like those drums are a lot further back than you'd think.
Mm.
This feels a little bit cleaner. But now I am truly guy gaming in mom's basement. So yay, I'm
W.
winning. Also, dude, check this out. I got this beholder.
Yeah, I know. I saw that.
The eye lights up.
Whoa.
Yeah, and it comes with this little book on how to train your beholder, and it's really funny. It's like
How to train your beholder?
Yeah, it's called Dame Beatrice J. Delacroix III's Guide for Training Your New Beholder, and it's like,
Did you buy that from like Wizards of the Coast?
I got it. I mean, it's made by Wizards of the Coast, but I bought it at Barnes & Noble. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so today I was thinking Stranger Things is popping off like this week.
Stranger Things is so big, and if you haven't watched it, you've been living under a rock. And you
Yeah,
should absolutely
Josiah.
go watch it.
Yes, you should, Josiah.
I am one of those people. I've never seen it.
But I was thinking Stranger Things is, in my opinion, done a lot for D&D, at least in the last few years. Like they didn't actually like endorse D&D, but the fact that they show so much D&D, I think kind of revitalized it a little bit and at least brought some people that didn't know what it was into the mix a little bit more.
Yeah, and aren't some of the some of the like monsters or whatever like straight up out of D&D, right?
Yeah. So the first so obviously the monster in Stranger Things, spoiler alert for Stranger Things, if you haven't seen it, again, like Josiah said, you're probably living under a rock.
Yeah.
Or you don't like scary things. In the first, so basically the monster is not actually from D&D. But every season, the monster has like a different ability or a different like form. And they name it after some sort of monster from D&D just because the kids play D&D so much that they know monsters and what it kind of reminds them of. So I think the first season is the first season's the Demogorgon.
Okay.
Which is a very legendary monster in Dungeons and Dragons. It's one of the strongest monsters in the game. It's basically like a two-headed monkey with tentacle arms in D&D, and it lives in the abyss. It is the king of the abyss. And then the second season is the bad guy's a mind flayer. And then in the third season, I think the third season was also the mind flayer. I think.
Okay. It like came back.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And then the fourth season, which is the season that just came out, it is Vecna, who is basically the bad guy of Dungeons and Dragons, basically. He's the Thanos of D&D, basically. And he's also the villain that Critical Role fought in their first campaign. Spoilers for Critical Role's first campaign. Sorry. Yeah, it's kind of cool. So they've it's very much been inspired by D&D in a lot of ways. They show kids playing it, and in the new season, they actually have like half an episode. I haven't finished the new season yet, but they have like half an episode dedicated to a D&D game, which is kind of funny.
Nice.
And then I just read an article yesterday that the kids from Stranger Things are going to be playing a game of D&D. I think it's probably like a one-shot to raise money for a charity like next week or something, which is cool too.
Nice.
But it's pretty clear that that Stranger Things has helped D&D in a lot of ways, at least bring some notoriety to it.
Right.
Which, is a good thing, I think, for the game. But some people are still going to have their issues with it. They've also, I know Wizards of the Coast has also put out a Stranger Things D&D game. It's like, I don't know if it's a one shot. I think it's like a mini campaign, and you play as like the characters, I believe. And they all have like D&D stats, and you play like a Stranger Things campaign.
Nice.
But anyways, I thought it'd be interesting to maybe, because of, Stranger Things and everything, to take kind of a look back at kind of the history of D&D in that time. Stranger Things takes place like in the 80s, I think. I'm terrible at like my 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I believe it's the 80s. And in the 80s, there was a lot of negativity towards Dungeons and Dragons. And I thought maybe it'd be fun to kind of talk about a little bit of what that was, why that was, and things like that.
Yeah, I can remember like because I think we've talked about this too on the podcast. Like my dad played D&D a lot when he was younger. Like he'd play with his friends, and that was in the 80s. Like he remembers, or well, maybe in the 80s he would have like just been like getting out of it, but I remember him saying stuff like, "Oh yeah, back then, there was, a lot of people kind of like frowned upon D&D because like they'd never heard of it, and when the way it was explained, kind of made it sound like and look like cult meetings,
Yeah.
and like it seemed satanic in a sense, because I mean, you're dealing with like creatures from hell and interacting with like demons and like creatures from the abyss and stuff like that. So and there's magic and spell casting and like wizards or whatever. Uh a lot more people were like pretty conservative about that stuff.
Yeah,
in
and rightly
that
so.
time.
I mean, it's understandable that you don't necessarily want your kid going to like talk about demons all day with his friends. But I think there's like a few things that people skip over or don't think about. I mean, I know that's the case, and that's the case. But yeah, so basically in the 80s, if you weren't born in the 80s and know nothing about it, there was this whole idea of like a satanic panic around D&D. And one of the reasons was a lot of the source material, the fronts of book covers and things like that, didn't necessarily show just dragons and dungeons. There were a lot that showed different idols and Ifrit and demons and, devils and things like that. And to be completely honest, demons and devils are very much a thing in D&D. It's not a lie. Right. And yeah, like hell is a thing in D&D. It's more of like a Greek idea of hell, kind of like a 9 hells kind of thing, but still, that is the case. But there was kind of this panic around, is it of like an occult? My kid is going to a basement with a bunch of his friends and sitting around a table and talking about demons and devils or whatnot. Now, another thing to preface is you could play D&D and never run into a demon or a devil or anything hellish,
right?
At all.
You can write your campaign however
you can do
want
it
and include
completely differently.
Monsters you want or have none.
Yeah. Right. You can do it completely different, and a lot of people do. But But that was one reason that everything started freaking out, and actually, or everyone kind of freaked out about it. And actually, in D&D, or the company Dungeons and Dragons, excuse me, did eventually realize that a lot of people were freaking out about that, and started actually changing a lot of their covers and books and things like that to make it seem more friendly, or to make it more friendly, and not as much like that. But there were a few other reasons that people kind of freaked out about it at the time. One of the big ones was male suicide was raising like crazy. I forget the exact statistics. I read them before this episode today. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this episode was because on my Twitter feed, I saw there's this D&D account I follow, and they posted this long article from the 80s about D&D. But one of the big things was male suicide was shooting up. I'm not sure why, but it was. And there were a lot of instances of people killing themselves shortly after playing D&D, or they were playing D&D and they had been known to play D&D and then they killed themselves after a while. Now a lot of it was blamed on Dungeons and Dragons. Parents would be like, my kid was playing this game and then he killed himself, which is very sad. But when you kind of look at the big picture, it seems like there's a lot more to it than just he was playing D&D. Most of the time, there were a lot of other underlying issues. Dungeons and Dragons was not a popular thing at the time. If you were playing it, you're probably a big nerd. I mean, if you're playing it now, you're still a big nerd, but it wasn't as acceptable back then as it is now. There were a lot of things that affected that, but that was one of the big reasons that it was frowned upon. It was because people were like, my kid is going to play this game, and he's getting lost in it, and then he's harming himself. So that you know, there's a lot of different aspects to it than just playing Dungeons and Dragons, but that was a big thing, where people blaming D&D for kind of the rise of suicides. Now, I would say, and I think you would agree with me, I wouldn't say there's truth to someone, you know, killing themselves over D&D, but I think honestly there is some sort of danger. If you're the type of person where you can't separate real life from games or from movies or imagination, that can you got to be careful playing this game. Because you would know as much as I do, it's pretty easy to get really lost in the game and to really enjoy the story that's happening. I mean, our group will text each other about it even during the week and like talk about different things and make jokes about it. But we're all very much mature enough to be able to separate the game from real life. We're not getting caught up in being our character or, you know, trying to fill the role that our character is filling in the game in real life. But I think there is, you know, in all honesty, you should be cautious of that. If you're the type of person that can't separate, you know, a game from real life, it can be really difficult, or I could see it being really difficult for, you know, once reality hits you in one way or another, you know, financial issues, health issues, whatever, to want it to be like this fake game could cause some issues, and you could, you know, very much, you know, get very sad very quickly when you realize that real life is not this imaginary life that you've been, you know, playing in once a week.
Right. Basically, what we're saying is don't go all Heath Ledger method with your D&D character.
To a degree, yeah.
Yeah.
It's important to say that. But I also don't believe that it is the cause of suicide. I don't think it's part of the occult at all. I don't think anyone playing it is playing it for satanic purposes, at least as far as I know. Um, and I think too, like when people actually play the game, they totally get it and are like, oh yeah, this is not what I thought it was. You
Right.
know, even people that might have thought that way back then.
Yeah. Well,
I
I
don't
was
know.
also going to
Yeah.
say, like, another reason I think back then that uh it was so associated with like primarily all this demonic stuff too was the fact that because the game was in like very early stages slash had really just started taking off in like an organized, somewhat systematic fashion, uh it wasn't as customizable as it is now. Like, you had the source material, and because it was a new thing and it was designed with like these certain like characters, locations, whatever in mind, um most people when they played the game, I think, were you doing exactly what was in like the source material. Like, I don't think a lot of people were homebrewing a lot of stuff
Right.
at
That's
that point
true.
in time.
Yeah. And
So there were
actually,
less options to customize it
yeah, that's
in
true.
that regard.
Now from the beginning of the game, like even in the first the first Dungeon Master's Guide, you know, Gary Gygax, the creator of it, was like use these rules as just kind of ideas, but not,
Right.
you know, in depth stuff. But you're right. There it wasn't as customizable. People were playing much more by the book. The way you played was way differently. It wasn't as much
Right.
role playing and discussion. It was much more just fighting and statistical based stuff. But another thing that's interesting is after kind of this panic around the game, Dungeons and Dragons as a company in the 80s actually backpedaled on all of the demonic and devil stuff because I think they really wanted to just clear their name from all of this stuff, but they backpedaled completely. There was a book that they used to sell called Deities and Demigods. It was basically all of the heaven and hell stuff from the game, all the angels,
Right.
all the demons, all the everything. They actually changed the name to Legends and Lore there. They changed all their book covers, and then they actually removed and stopped using the words devil and demon from all of their books. And they changed them to make believe terms Tenari and Batezu. If I'm saying that wrong, I'm sorry. But that was basically their idea of angels and demons, was that instead. Because they really didn't want that. Now, when Wizards of the Coast put out their version in the 2000s, they actually went back to it and they were like, you know, they put it back out and a new edition of Deities and Demigods came out and they kind of revamped that area of it. But I don't think that's, you know, a big part of the game. If you don't want to use that stuff, you don't have to at all. So yeah, anyways, that's kind of a little bit of, you know, how what the satanic panic was a little bit about. It was mainly just people that had underlying issues going on, playing a game that it is easy to get lost in and feel like you have a better life in the game than you do in real life. And that can affect you. So, you know, honestly, I would say, you know, if you take a look at yourself and feel like you might be that kind of person, I would say be careful with the game. Because, you know, you don't want to do that.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you understand that it's just a game, then it can be a great time.
Yeah. If you've played any uh especially video games, I guess, if you've played any uh to like a greater extent than most people, and you are like doing mentally fine, then
Yeah.
I'd say you're good. But also, I'm not a professional. I'm I'm not a psychologist, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, talk to your talk. Ask your doctor if Dungeons and Dragons is right for you.
Well, and also, I mean, just recommendation to DMs, you know, and people that just want to start a game with friends. This is something that I kind of wish I did during your first campaign, but I just wasn't knowledgeable enough. You know, talk to your players about how they're doing with that and what they're okay with and what they're not okay with. Full transparency, we had an entire part where we went to Avernus, which is like the first level of hell. And there's like, you know, it's full of demons and devils and stuff. Now, I
Right.
personally think it's more, it doesn't feel like hell as much as it feels like just this like dystopian wasteland where you just,
Yeah.
because there's literally like giant Mad Max machines and you're just riding around like in this like heavy metal environment. And I think it's pretty cool. But I do wish that, you know, before I did that, I talked to my players of like, hey, you know, if this kind of stuff was brought in, would you be okay with that? Is that something you want to stay away from? I think that's something that would have been nice. Now, I'm not really planning much of it for this campaign, so I didn't really talk to you guys about it this time around either.
Right.
But I feel like I more know the lines now than I did before. But anyways, if you're trying to start a game, or if you're a DM and you're trying to create a game, maybe talk to your players about what they think they can quote unquote handle and what they
Right.
would rather not to mess with. Because, you know, you still want to respect people and their opinions, and you want the game to be fun for everybody. So if there's, you know, and stuff like locations and certain types of monsters and creatures is something that can easily be worked around to make the game enjoyable for everyone and not crossing a line that they don't want to cross, I guess.
Right.
So yeah. Got anything else to say?
Actually, yeah. I guess kind of like my last thought on all this, because right, like after I got into Dungeons and Dragons like a year or so ago, and then especially once I started doing this podcast and people who follow me online and like go to my church and stuff, like some older generation people were like drawing me out a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons, because
Oh,
they
really?
and
I didn't know that.
yeah, and like my mom would like tell her friends, "Oh,
Oh,
Josiah's been
okay.
playing this game," like, you
Yeah,
know,
my parents tell people too, and I'm
yeah,
just like,
yeah. I mean, it's fine. Like,
yeah, it's
I
fine.
like
It's
talking
whatever.
about it, and I enjoy it, so I don't
Yeah, me
mind
too.
being asked about it. But occasionally, uh, uh an older generation person would ask me like, "Hey, so, you know, I hear you're into Dungeons and Dragons now. What do you say about, you know, the stuff I've heard about the game, having not played it before, all this like demonic stuff, like
Yeah, I've
what's
been
going
asked that
on
question
there?"
a few times too.
And kind of the best case I've made for it in that context, talking to people who have those concerns, is like, I mean, it's a fantasy thing, right? I always like to take stuff like this, it's like fantasy but a gray area for people, so Dungeons and Dragons, Harry Potter and stuff, and go and compare it to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is a widely accepted uh fantasy world, like the
Yeah,
whole
sure.
Narnia thing. And you know, kind of compare it like, hey, there's magic and witches and stuff in those books. Um
Uh-oh.
and there's no
Wait, we
issue
lost you for a
there.
second. There was
What?
like a
Oh,
little
you lost me?
delay. Say it again.
Oops. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back now.
Okay. Uh but just kind of like comparing it to like accepted uh
Material.
fantasy materials that they are, you know, familiar with,
Yeah.
and just kind of point out that, you know, within Dungeons and Dragons, all that, the demons, the 9 levels of hell, um I mean, it's just a more tangible uh representation, I guess, of that, because like you don't want to you Christians don't deny that like the spiritual exists. Like there are angels and there are
Sure, yeah.
demons, right? And so I feel like there's a difference between engaging with that stuff in like a harmful way, like, you know, uh trying to actually like call on and communicate with demons and like
Yeah, yeah.
real cult stuff
Mhm.
versus Dungeons and Dragons, which is just you're in this fantasy world playing make believe characters that have an interaction with, something that kind of represents uh hell in a sense, but it's not like it's not the same. It's very much like a totally different universe. Again, it's all pretend, doesn't exist. No one's getting, you know,
Yeah.
into it like that. And uh I feel like if you're gonna just uh oh, I lost my train of thought. If you're gonna dismiss Dungeons and Dragons just based on the fact that there's like mention of hell and demons and that those things exist in that universe, it's it's one of those things where maybe you're not comfortable with the concept of hell and demons, and so you just want to pretend that that stuff doesn't exist. But if you truly believe it does, uh, being in a context where those things are mentioned or discussed to a degree, um, shouldn't be a problem. I feel
Sure.
like, if that
I know
makes
what you
sense,
mean. Mhm. I
you
know what
know.
you mean.
So
Yeah.
I find a not as long winded way to communicate that, and that normally kind of uh dissipates the
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think what I would say though is like I have two thoughts on this as well because I've also been asked very similar questions. Um, Number one, I do feel like most people are worried. They understand that it's fake and that it's a fantasy world and whatnot. I think a lot of people are more worried about you getting lost in it or so fixed in it that you start to believe it, and then some
right.
of the topics or things that you're covering in the game, you start to dig into more and you lose touch with reality. And, from a Christian standpoint of reality, the spiritual reality is even more real than this one,
Right.
to a degree. And so, they're worried that if you're getting lost in this fake one, you won't understand the real one or be able to separate the two. And that worries a lot of people, and they don't want you to get lost. So, to their understanding, I totally get that. Now, the other thing that I always think about when people ask me that, and this isn't always the case, but a lot of the time, people want like a quick answer on this. Like, well, what do you think of like the hell and demons in it? Gotcha, kind of thing.
Right.
But I a lot of times have just because I've tried to explain it to people so many times, but it like even you just now, it's hard to explain quickly.
Right.
A lot of times I'll be like, yeah, I mean, I would love to talk to you about it and kind of discuss it in more detail. It's not necessarily something I can explain to you that you'll understand in a couple minutes, without understanding how the game works and, things like that, because it really is kind of hard to explain well. Now the Chronicles of Narnia, comparison is actually a really good one. But it is hard to explain the game without people knowing what it is. And a lot of the time, people that are asking those kind of questions don't know what it is. I don't think I've ever run into someone who knew how to play the game and maybe has played it before, but still had a problem with that kind of stuff,
Right.
or asked that question, I guess. So most of the time now, I'll just be like, yeah, I mean, I would love to talk to you about it and explain kind of how the game works and, my thoughts on that area. If I was going to sum it up quickly, I don't have an issue with it because it's something that can be easily avoided, and I understand that it's not real in terms of the game. And yeah, like you said, I mean, I'm comfortable, and I believe that, angels and demons do exist to a degree as a Christian. And so, the topic of it does not necessarily, the topic of it in a fantasy setting does not necessarily make me uncomfortable, or think different weird things about it, I guess.
Right. And also, I understand the true reality of those things, and so if they're represented differently uh in a game, like that's fine because I already know
Right. Yeah.
I'm already familiar with how they kind of exist in real life, and am able to separate that from
Right.
how they're depicted in a fantasy setting.
Right. And it all does come back to, if we were going to if that same person who was like, do you have a problem with demons and devils and hell being in the game? That's the kind of person who, before playing, I would want to know that they're able to separate that from real life, because if you're even asking those questions, I'm worried that you wouldn't be able to, and then maybe the game's just not for you unless you take out, you can easily take out that kind of stuff. But even still, like playing just a normal character in a normal world without any spiritual stuff going on, I'd still want to make sure that you can separate reality from the game. But yeah, I feel like it's a little deeper, and it's hard to explain in just like a few sentences why, why most people are okay with it. There's easy ways around it. But yeah, I mean, if you're listening to this and you're kind of thinking that, I'm more than open to a discussion about what I think about it. And it's kind of hard to sum up quickly without explaining the whole game to you and how it works and everything like that.
Yeah.
And we're not going to do that in this episode, but yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, our entire group knows who they are as people.
Right.
They know what they think as people, and they know how to separate truth from reality, and that's or truth from fantasy, and that's important when playing. There was one other thing that I was going to say. There's an article. I'll link it in the description of this episode. There's an article by this Christian guy. I don't know if he's a pastor, but he's a Christian dude, and he plays a game of D&D with a bunch of other Christians. And they kind of set up kind of some rules for the game to stay away from that stuff because they just don't feel comfortable using it. Mm-hmm. But it's a good article about his thoughts on that idea of, separating reality, or, dealing with those ideas of demons and devils and stuff like that,
right?
And how to play the game if you're uncomfortable with that kind of stuff, and the rules they've set up, not only in terms of that stuff in the world, but also in terms of how they make characters and their magic system and things like that. So I'll link it below if you're someone who kind of thinks that way.
Instead of spells, you have God-given gifts and abilities.
No, it's not like that. It's more just like it's kind of the Lord of the Rings approach. Like, have you ever wondered why Christians are so okay with the Lord of the Rings having magic and things like that? It's because the idea from Lord of the Rings and from Tolkien's view of magic was kind of that of in comparison, D&D sorcerer approach, where it was something you're just naturally born with. And it's not something that you're calling on a greater power for. So if you're naturally born with it and it's just natural to you, then, it's not like you're having to worship some god to get it.
Right.
And that's kind of why the Christian community is so okay with Lord of the Rings, is because now most people probably don't know that, but that's the idea Tolkien had behind the magic system, which is why Christians are okay with it. D&D can be a little bit different, but again, this article has kind of a good way to explain that if that's the way you want to play, he has some custom rules that he and his group have made to make them comfortable with the game. Now, we play differently, but that's the best part about this game. You can play it the way you want to play it, and there's no boundaries. And what's great too is that's the way it was intended to be played. The creators of Dungeons and Dragons would be thrilled to hear that you found a way to play it without all this stuff that makes you uncomfortable. They'd be like, that's awesome. Great. Good
Yeah.
for you. We're excited and happy that you're playing our game.
We'll write a source book. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I don't know. I think I'm just rambling at this point, but the game's great because you can set it up in a way that makes you and your group comfortable. And, our encouragement is just make sure that you separate reality from the game and make sure that you can easily do that. And if you can't easily do that, then maybe take a step back and figure out why. And maybe talk to your DM about it if you feel like it's something specific in the game or whatnot.
Yeah. And again, disclaimer: none of this is mental health advice. Do not
No.
take it as so. Please talk to an actual mind doctor.
Yeah, don't talk to us.
We are not brain doctors.
No, we're
do
not.
not claim to be.
No, we don't. This is not mental health advice at all.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyways, that's all I got.
Yep.
You got anything else?
We're
already at 40 minutes.
Sweet. Yeah, we're not brain doctors.
We're not brain doctors. Have fun.
Really trying to cover our bases here.
All right, man. Well, that was a fun episode. Everyone, subscribe on all the platforms and whatnot. Do the things.
Yes, please do.
Leave a review on the podcast if you're listening to the audio version, and subscribe on YouTube if you're watching the YouTube version. That's it.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's all we got.
That's all, folks.
See ya.
All right.
On
Peace.
the next flippity flip time.
Peace.